Welcome to Conversations with the Authors.
Hello, and welcome back. I'm your host, Daniel Troop.
I'm Daryl.
I'm Sandra Jo.
And thank you once again, dear listeners and readers, for pressing the play button. In this episode, my parents, Daryl and Sandra, will share their experience in conducting research to bring their fantastical world to life. From the dialogue to the cultural and historical inspirations that informed their writing. Also explore how they balanced the need for creativity with the importance of staying true to their research, and the techniques they used to ensure their fantasy world remained relatable and believable to readers. Whether you're an aspiring fantasy writer or a lover of the genre, this episode is a must-listen. So join us as we delve into the magical world of how Nicholas became Santa Claus. Can you talk about your process for incorporating language in world building and how it helped to create believable characters?
Well, language is intrinsic to the story because we all have language of some sort. There's audible language, there's body language, which you have to write actually into the story. We wanted to make sure that they were believable, understandable, but sufficiently different from ordinary language. You won't hear slang or anything like that, so that people can feel as if they've gone off into another world.
And you just mentioned writing body language into a story. How do you do that?
Well, it's just really a matter of description, I think. You picture the movements that you want to do, and you write those. You write it as if you were trying to describe it in a picture or in a movie. And that's what I do. I like to have something very descriptive so I can paint this picture in your mind. This moving picture, actually.
You have facial expressions, hand gestures, body gestures, the way people react to it. The same way, the same
sort of nuances and such.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if somebody's reacting to a situation, if they're reacting to something they've been told, if they're surprised, these are all different types of movements that you'll want to describe. And sometimes you can leave those things to the imagination of the reader, and sometimes it's a good thing to do that. But if you want them to have the idea that you had in their head, then you make that description. Description.
Is there such a thing as too much description?
Well, I don't know if it's too much. It's got to be appropriate, I think. Mm-hmm. And sometimes there are little things that you do leave to one's imagination. But sometimes, if the description furthers the story, and if you're trying to elicit the emotion of shock or surprise or joy, if that's germane to the story, that may be something you want to describe. I mean, if it's such as someone walking to a door to open a door, you might not need to do that unless that person's been hurt and he's limping and he's dragging his foot and he can't see the door, his vision is blurry, and he tries to reach for the door and he reaches out, but he gets one of the images of the door rather than the real door because he's seeing double. I mean, so there's an appropriate time to do it, and other times where you wouldn't have to.
So, Sandy, for you, and Daryl, you can jump in on this if you want to, how do you decide what the readers should create and what you should create for them?
It depends on what I'm trying to relay. Sometimes I want the reaction to be bold and hitting you in the face kind of stuff, and then I'll have Daddy describe everything.
And then sometimes you want subtleties too, so those have to be described too, so that you know how the character's reacting.
Well, can you give a example of specific language or dialogue that you incorporated into your book or books, and how it helped to develop your characters or the setting?
Well, in the new piece that I'm writing,
Darkly Heart.
Yes, Darkly Heart. I've got, and this is part of the Nicholas series too. I have characters from various lands, and they have various accents. I've got someone who's French. I've got someone else who's Scottish. So I try to do a little research on that to see how they may say things so that I can convey it in a way that would be convincing that this person is from that place. And so we want to have a realistic character, not a caricature of somebody, but a realistic character. It takes a bit of work sometimes. I mean, unless you speak bilingually or trilingually, and I don't, so it takes a lot more work for me to do that.
And then there's sometimes, like with my magical characters, I really threw Daddy a right hook because some of our characters spoke in clang, so everything had to rhyme.
Ah, okay.
And then there were some characters where they said everything backwards, kind of like Yoda.
Well, you mean like I remember the trolls?
Yes, yes.
And
Yes.
when they were very small creatures, and when they walk, all of them walk with a limp, and they spoke in rhyme.
Uh,
Yeah, that was kind of cool. Though. I enjoyed that.
like when one of my favorite opening introductions to the trolls is Tom is trying to go home and he has to cross this little.
It's a conduit that
yes,
goes across the road.
In the book, there's like a small piece of wood that's covering this tiny little thing.
Yeah, so
water.
Right.
Yeah.
But bridge trolls gotta be bridge trolls.
It's just a little sliver in the path where water has to go from one side of the road to the other, and it undercuts the road through a conduit. But of course, technically that's a bridge, right? So you've got a troll there.
Troll's got a troll.
And the water, the water going under it was no bigger than my little finger, and I have small hands, so you can imagine how small that is.
Yes.
And if he didn't pay the toll, he could not cross the bridge.
And he was a troll, so he spoke in rhyme. Mm-hmm. I mean, he wasn't mischievous or mean,
right?
And
it was just sort of
kind of likable,
but
it was just their nature. It was somebody they had to deal with.
How did you approach balancing historical accuracy with the need to create a fantastical world? What considerations did you make along the way?
Well, when you're writing fantasy, sometimes accuracy is not something that you're confounded with. It's not something that you need to do. I think what you want to do is give an air of familiarity.
The essence.
Yeah, because people, who've read things and know some history have some familiarity, and you've seen stories before.
Right.
So to have some accuracy is probably helpful to help the person relate to the story. Mm-hmm. But in fantasy and with magic, you're very far from reality. I suppose there are some things in magic that we would expect to always happen.
Right.
And so it's just like, in the old vampire movies, you expect that somewhere in one of those movies, Dracula's he's gonna be repelled, by a cross, or or the Wolfman is gonna be repelled by garlic, and all the rest of this. So it becomes almost canon. It's something that you expect. So as far as our writing is concerned, we want to have some familiarity where the person can relate to it.
For continuity, I would draw either the location or what the character looked like, what he was wearing, what I wanted them to, I wanted the outfits to change, or how I wanted the scenery to change. And on my drawings, I would have footnotes or little messages to myself written in the corners and colors.
But you also specify that in fantasy, accuracy is not necessarily important. So, inaccuratesms. How did you decide when to let history or research sort of go to the wayside a bit for creativity? How did you decide where the balance was? Well,
with fantasy, it's important further your story and get the story out. And so sometimes you might have to let a little bit of accuracy go for poetic license, to further the story along.
Right. So
it makes me think. Do you remember? Anybody remember the movie Abraham Lincoln, Vampire Slayer?
Right.
What vampires did he slay?
Right.
So that was not very accurate.
Right.
And his wife was there. Mary Todd Lincoln was there. The children were there, and that was about as accurate as you needed to be for that. But
in that same sense, the historical accuracy of Nicholas is that Nicholas was at some point a real person in history, and that's about as accurate to his story as we get.
Yeah, he was a real person. Nicholas, as anybody who knows history knows, that he lived about 300 years after the Common Era, and he was at the Conference of Nicaea.
Right.
And that's the place where the religious got together, and they were going to decide what was going to go in the Bible.
Because in your book, Nicholas is a little bit of a hothead, and you take that from these historical accounts of Nicholas at Nicaea, right?
Correct.
Right. He was, because while he was there, there were reputedly there were some men who had been put on trial and were going to be executed by a mob, and supposedly the real Nicholas saved them, from being killed. So his hot-headedness or his want to make things correct and be moral was in this story.
Right, and I think, I don't know personally how old he was at the conference, but
about 50.
I think it lends itself. I think that attitude lends itself to Nicholas in the story, who in this book follows to the age of 18. He gets older in the following books, but I think it lends itself better to his character design. When starting research for your book, what was the first step you took, and how did that inform your world building or craftsmanship?
Research, I think, while we were writing was on a need to know basis. I think when we get to a point in the story where we were trying to describe, for instance, a castle. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are not many castles in the United States,
right?
And a lot of people are unfamiliar with castles, as was I.
Right.
So we had to look those things up to find out what's the bastion wall, what's the curtain wall, what are the crenellations, what are all of these things?
Right, but this is not a story that is set in, say, the 16th century or the 14th century, but the research allows you to allude to that era in a sense without pinpointing anything down.
Yeah, I think that's probably a common way to do things, don't you think?
Yeah.
It's just like in Lord of the Rings and the Rings of Power.
Right.
They have years and they can tell you, but their years are different from our years.
Right.
It's almost like Star Trek. This is the 20, 40, 60 log and whatever that might be.
Yeah.
So we leave that a little bit nebulous, and that doesn't become completely important. It's just the continuity of the story and how it follows. You can follow them from day to day, and that's what's important.
So
I actually went to the British kings and queens' castles and looked at their servant list and their lists of rooms that they had in their castles, and who was in charge and who wasn't. And
right. I've seen some photographic encyclopedias that sort of break down, like the inner curtain and the outer curtain and all these. So I can see where you might need. That's a point in which you might need specific research.
And she talked about the British system and of royalty, and she alluded to that, and then castles and peerage and all that. We had a time with that because we weren't used to that. Right. So we had to really work on that a lot.
So pulling from the other side, pulling from needing to be completely accurate to something that is not necessarily historically accurate, depending on who you are and what you believe. But folklore and myth, how did you incorporate that in your story? And how did you use those elements to adapt into the world you were creating?
It was story driven.
Okay.
Yeah, it wasn't
It was story driven.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
It depended on what the story needed to have done as to whether a magical character was going to do it, or a human character, or a combination thereof. Whether it was the good side or the bad side, and who was going to be not quite good and not quite bad, and why were they like that?
And how did creating the setting for your book, how did you go about creating that, and what inspired you most when it came to world building? And not necessarily for just how Nicholas became Santa Claus, but perhaps darkly, and I know that you're working on another project, and perhaps some of the sci-fi that I know that you tend to write. How do you...
You have to use a lot of imagination. Imagination is the key. Somebody asked Albert Einstein once what was important. Was it the physics or was it the imagination? And he said it's imagination.
Right.
So, having all that knowledge and not having an imagination won't move you very far. So we had to use quite a bit of imagination.
All work and no play scenario.
My favorite Uncle Barney had this famous quote he would always say, and it was a quote of his own, and that was, "Imagination is the first question. Without it, you don't go anywhere."
And contrary, to that, someone asked Edison once what was important, when he was inventing his inventions, the light bulb or whatever, and the many various other things he made. And he said that his creative process was 99% perspiration and 1% imagination. But imagination, even that 1% is a lot, because that's something that will take you far, like Albert Einstein said. So, and we used our imagination to fill in the gaps.
Can you talk about the inspirations from your own world that you've sort of interweaved in these new fantasy worlds that you're creating?
Sometimes our inspirations may be music we've heard. It may be my wife takes pictures. It may be an insect that she's taking a picture of. It may be a scene of an animal. It may be even a word. Sometimes sometimes you can flip through a dictionary and you can see a word. See, that's a new word. That's an interesting word. Maybe I can use this somehow.
Oh yeah.
So, even on the television, sometimes we'd be cooking, or we'd be feeding you guys, or we'd be doing physical therapy or something, and somebody would say something and go, "Oh, wait a minute, that'll work." And then
that's interesting. It just comes to you sometimes, at the strangest times.
Yes, anything can really influence your creativity, like the intro to our podcast by Alexander Nakarada, the super epic, aptly titled song. And if you guys are interested in the imaginations and the machinations and the fantasy of how Nicholas became Santa Claus, you can check out the book at troopbooks.com. You can also visit their Facebook page at Troop Books, their Twitter, Troop Books, their Instagram, Troop Books, TROUPE. Landing on the website, troopbooks.com, will take you to the authors page at Ewing's, and you can purchase a copy, hard copy, or a paper book. And we will see you, hopefully, next week. Thank you, Mom and Dad. I look forward to our next conversation on Conversations with the Authors.
Thank you.